You know, if it's not about sports, I find it very hard to concentrate.
Hey, what is up guys? Brayden here, and today we are talking about what is known as the Malice at the Palace, when players and fans fought each other at an NBA game. It took place on November 19th, 2004 at the very end of a game between the Detroit Pistons and the Indiana Pacers. The two teams had always had somewhat of a rivalry, mainly due to proximity, but it had been heating up in recent years. In fact, the previous season, the two teams had met in the Eastern Conference Finals. The series was dominated by defense. I mean, check out some of these scores. Guys, these are NBA games. Not just that, but playoff games. I mean, look at Game 6. 69-65? Those are high school scores. Neither team even scored more than 90 points in a single game during this series. The Pistons were trying to get their first NBA championship since the bad boy era of the 1980s, when dudes like Dennis Rodman and Bill Laimbeer brutalized their opponents. Meanwhile, the Pacers were in search of their first ever championship, and one man in particular desperately wanted one, and that was none other than Reggie Miller, the aging superstar shooting guard who was playing out the twilight years of his career, a career he had spent entirely in Indiana. He had no bling on his fingers, but if that was going to happen, his best chance would be the 2003-04 season. But the Pistons wanted it equally as bad. There was just one problem though. Whoever won this game would have to face the absolute juggernaut that was the Los Angeles Lakers, who were absolutely stacked with talent. The two big ones that everybody knows about, obviously, are Kobe and Shaq, but this team was more than just those two. They had a fantastic supporting cast. Karl Malone was on that team too, although he wasn't in his prime, but still solid nonetheless. Horace Grant was also another valuable member, and while once again not in his prime, still contributed. And Derek Fisher also was a fantastic piece, and as a Jazz fan I can tell you, Fisher is a baller. When the Jazz went to the Western Conference Finals in 2007, he was an integral part. But that's not to say the Pistons and Pacers were devoid of talent either. They had some hoopers on their team too. The Pacers had arguably one of the best young rosters in the league, and the young guys were prepared to take the mantle from Reggie Miller and lead the organization into a bright future. Their best player that year was a feisty small forward out of St. John's, who would later become known as Metta World Peace, but in those days went by Ron Artest. He spent the first few seasons of his career with the Chicago Bulls before being traded to Indiana midway through the 2001-02 season. He was known as being a tough player with a short temper. He was talented though, quickly becoming one of the best rising stars during that time period, establishing himself as a pretty good defender who played with tenacity. The Pacers also boasted size with Jermaine O'Neal, a center and power forward combo who had shared a front court with Rasheed Wallace and Arvydas Sabonis in Portland before he arrived in Indiana. O'Neal was not known as a prolific scorer, which isn't to say he was terrible offensively, but he made a name for himself on defense. By 2004, he was considered one of the better defensive players in the league, averaging over 2 blocks per game for several seasons straight. The Pacers also had an up-and-coming guard-forward combo by the name of Steven Jackson, who had been a second-round draft pick and spent his first few seasons after being drafted with the Lacrosse Bobcats of the Continental Basketball League, which was the predecessor to today's G League. He played internationally as well, making stops in Australia and a few other countries before breaking into the NBA in 2000 with the New Jersey Nets. He played for the Spurs and Hawks before ultimately being traded to the Pacers following the 2003-04 season. The previous season in Atlanta, he posted solid numbers of 18.1 points per game, 4.6 rebounds per game, and 3.1 assists per game. Steven Jackson also brought championship experience to a Pacers team that had very little experience in that department, as he had won the 2003 NBA Finals with the Spurs. But the Pistons were pretty good themselves, and one man in particular, that man being Ben Wallace, a player that had been overlooked coming out of a small Division II school in Richmond, Virginia. He was not drafted, but made a roster spot in Washington, playing for the Bullets/Wizards franchise for a few seasons before finding himself in Orlando and eventually in Detroit. Wallace was well known as one of the top defensive players of that era, being named to 5 NBA All-Defensive teams and winning back-to-back Defensive Player of the Year awards in 2001-02 and 2002-03, and winning 4 total in his career. He also made the NBA All-Star game 4 times. He was a fierce competitor, taking pride in shutting down anyone who dared to try and challenge him in the paint. Shooting guard Rip Hamilton, known for his signature mask that he wore, also was a huge contributor for the Pistons. Coming out of UConn and being drafted 7th overall by the Wizards, he had a rough rookie season, but only continued to get better every year. A year before arriving in Detroit in 2002, he averaged 20 points per game in Washington, and was known as a crafty guard that could always find a way to get buckets when you needed him to. The Pistons would end up defeating the Pacers in 6 games in the 2004 Eastern Conference Finals and subsequently pulled off the upset against the star-studded Lakers to become world champions. Heading into the 2004-05 season, they were actually considered among the favorites to win the NBA championship, and many thought they had a chance to go back-to-back. Heading into that November 19th, 2004 matchup between the two rivals, Indiana actually had a better record at 6-2, while the defending champion Pistons had been struggling to live up to the preseason hype, limping to a 4-3 record heading into the game. The game took place at the Palace in Auburn Hills, Michigan, and so it was a home game for the Pistons. The game was being televised nationally. Just like the previous year's Eastern Conference Finals series between the two squads, the game was also dominated by defense. However, the Pacers would lead by as much as 20 points in the first half. Now, these two teams were not on friendly terms and constantly took cheap shots at each other whenever they could. In the fourth quarter, Rip Hamilton drove his elbow into the back of Jamal Tinsley, causing the Pacers bench to jump up and scream for the ref's attention to call a flagrant foul. Mere minutes later, Ben Wallace himself took a cheap shot when he knocked Ron Artest into the base of the basket, and it was clear things were getting dangerously close to bubbling over, and indeed they would. With just under a minute left to go in the game, with the Pacers leading 97-82, Wallace drove to the basket and took a hard foul from Artest, receiving a hard slap across the back of the head. This was no doubt payback for the hard foul that Wallace had dished out earlier to Artest, but Wallace nonetheless did not take it well. Wallace spun around and shoved Artest with both hands. The two teams came together and referees tried desperately to break up the skirmish. At first, it seemed like it would be diffused quickly. I mean, anyone who watches sports knows that this sort of thing happens from time to time, but it's usually resolved quickly. Artest, for his part, decided the best course of action was to remove himself from the situation, but how he chose to do that was unorthodox to say the least. He laid down on the scorer's table and grabbed a headset to speak with Pacers radio broadcaster Mark Boyle. The broadcast team immediately cut the mic, as given Artest's well-known temper, he was liable to say anything, and wanting to comply with FCC standards and practices, the broadcast team decided it would be best to prevent the problem before it even happened. But that's when a single cup, partially filled with brown liquid called Diet Coke, completely sent this situation into chaos. It was hurled by a Pistons fan named John Green and made contact with Artest in the chest. Artest went absolutely nuts, leaping from the table and charging directly into the stands. Artest grabbed who he thought was the culprit, but in fact was a completely innocent bystander by the name of Michael Ryan. Mark Boyle attempted to prevent Artest from entering the stands, but Artest sent him flying backwards and stepped on him, causing him to fracture 5 of his vertebrae. Meanwhile, Artest began screaming at Ryan, "Did you do it?" And Ryan pleaded his case to the enraged Artest, repeating, "No, man, no." Steven Jackson leaped into the stands too and punched a fan named William Paulson, who had himself thrown a drink in Artest's face as he held Ryan in his grip. Other Pacers players, including Reggie Miller, ran into the stands to try and remove Artest and Jackson and get them into the locker room. John Green, the man who had started this whole mess, punched Artest in the back of the head repeatedly and tried to get Artest into a headlock, while Pistons fans began throwing food, drinks, and objects onto the court in frustration. Artest was finally removed from the stands, but it was not quite over yet, because as he walked away, 2 more fans, AJ Shackelford and Charlie Haddad, followed him. Artest punched Shackelford in the face, causing Haddad to defend Shackelford by punching Artest, but both men fell to the floor. While Haddad was on the ground, another Pacers player, Anthony Johnson, punched him in the back of the head. Then something happened that could have been extremely scary to witness, and possibly even deadly. As Haddad began to stand up, Jermaine O'Neal punched him in the jaw with a running start, and it could have ended the man's life, but luckily, O'Neal slipped in a puddle of liquid and fell backwards as his arm came forward, significantly lessening the blow. Fans began to stream onto the court looking for players to fight. Only 3 police officers were at the game that day, and arena security and the 3 cops were completely overwhelmed. Pacers coach Rick Carlisle, who is their current coach in 2024 as well, later said he felt like he was fighting for his life. Carlisle had previously coached the Pistons and was no doubt familiar with how rowdy the Detroit crowd could be. Pacers assistant coach Chuck Person said this, quote, "We were trapped in a gladiator-type scene where the fans were the lions and we were just trying to escape with our lives. That's how it felt. There was no exit. You had to fight your way out," unquote. Referees ended the game with 45.9 seconds remaining and the Pacers leading 97-82, and they were awarded with the win. Pistons PA announcer John Mason pleaded with the fans to calm down and to quit throwing food and drinks at Pacers players and staff. Meanwhile, in the Pacers locker room, Stephen Jackson and Ron Artest had a nervous conversation amongst themselves. Artest asked Jackson if he thought they were going to get in trouble. Stephen Jackson looked at Ron Artest in bewilderment. "Are you serious, bro? Trouble? Ron, we'll be lucky if we have a freaking job." Soon after, Auburn Hills police burst into the locker room to arrest Pacers players who had been involved in the violence, but the team rushed them onto a bus and took off just in the nick of time. But this would not mean that they would escape charges. The police did in fact hand down charges. Artest and Jackson were charged with 1 count of assault and battery each. Jackson pleaded no contest and was given 2 years probation and was ordered by a judge to pay $6,000 in restitution to the victims. Artest was given probation and community service. Other Pacers players that were involved were also charged, notably Jermaine O'Neal, who was given a year of probation and community service. John Green, the Pistons fan who started everything, had the unfortunate luck of having the county prosecutor be his neighbor, so he was very easy to identify. Green, as well as Charlie Haddad, were both banned from attending Pistons games for life. Green, as it turns out, was quite the career criminal, accruing quite the long rap sheet that included counterfeiting, carrying a concealed weapon, felony assault, and 3 drunk driving convictions. As a matter of fact, Green was on probation for DUI at the time that all of this happened. In March of 2006, a jury convicted Green of assault and battery for punching Ron Artest, but he was acquitted on the charge of throwing the cup, for whatever reason. I mean, we have video footage, but whatever, I guess. We got the important charges to stick at least. Ron Artest was suspended by the NBA for a total of 86 games. Stephen Jackson received a 30-game suspension and Jermaine O'Neal received 25 games, but upon appeal was reduced to 15 games. Ben Wallace of the Pistons got a 6-game ban and Anthony Johnson got 5. Reggie Miller, despite not fighting anyone and trying to get Artest out of the stands in order to protect the fans from him, still received a 1-game suspension for entering the stands. The Pistons finished the 2004-05 season with a 54-28 record and returned to the NBA Finals, but lost to the Spurs. As of this video's release date, that's the last time the Pistons have appeared in the NBA Finals. The Pacers finished with a record of 44-38 and lost to guess who? The Pistons in the playoffs, this time in the conference semifinals, losing the series to the Pistons once again in 6 games. People around the NBA were shocked by this event, which later became known as the Malice at the Palace. Many basketball fans, coaches, and players agreed that it was the worst brawl they had ever seen. Hockey player Chris Chelios, who spent time in Detroit with the Red Wings, called the fight unbelievable. You know it's bad when even a hockey player thinks the fight was unbelievable. On February 17, 2005, the NBA imposed new security guidelines for all of its arenas. Among the changes were a size limit on alcoholic beverages and a limit of only 2 alcoholic beverages per person. In addition, alcohol could not be sold after the start of the 4th quarter. The NBA also required that each team put at least 3 security guards between players and fans. This brawl will forever live in infamy, but I'd be lying if I said the brawl wasn't fun to watch. Luckily, no one was seriously injured or even worse, killed, but this incident no doubt changed the course of NBA history and changed many policies and protocols, which is obviously for the best. If you liked this video, leave a like. If you hated it, leave a dislike, but either way, subscribe and comment for the algorithm. Peace out.